G'day guys, ZiggyD here. In this video I want to talk to you guys today about my first impressions and experiences with the Blade & Soul Technical Alpha Weekend, which I just finished up playing. Blade & Soul is an upcoming MMO here to the west. It's actually been out in Korea, China and Russia for a few years now, and over time over there it's become a bit of an esports title. Especially the 1v1 PvP is incredibly competitive, and I hear it's quite well balanced, and there's some really high tier play. I actually tuned into a bit of a Korean tournament as well. Obviously I couldn't understand any of the casting, but the gameplay was fast and furious and intense and looked incredibly deep. So I was pretty interested in this idea because generally speaking I don't like PvP in gear-based games. But I heard that Blade & Soul, although it is an MMORPG and it has gear and you progress your character through PvE and all of that jazz, the PvP features like a gear scaling mechanism, and then what comes down to, for the most part, is your character's skill selection and your personal skill, your knowledge of both your class and your opponent's class, and how well you play and how, like, the mind games you'll play with your opponent. And it sounded really quite deep and interesting. Now, I knew I'd have maybe not the best experience with this going into this, playing from Australia on the US servers, and I was getting around 250 milliseconds ping, which for a fast action combat game that very heavily relies on combos and counters and timings and things like that, I knew I wouldn't have the best time. But regardless, and despite that horrible latency that I had to deal with, I still had a lot of fun with the PvP in Blade & Soul. Now, just to get it out of the way, the PvE in this game is the industry standard of 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years ago. It's very much what you'd expect, the same sort of questing. It's kind of got a bit of a cute story, and there were a few feelsy moments, so I won't spoil any of that, but that side of it was okay. But, you know, the questing and all of that jazz, and it was super easy to quest through PvE. The leveling experience, at least as far as PvE concerned, is quite boring and quite standard. There's nothing really special to write home about there. It's a good-looking game in terms of its artistic vision, which is quite well achieved. It has a nice theme and everything, but because this is a game that is quite a few years old already, it's not very good in terms of graphical fidelity, like texture quality and stuff like that can be quite low. Despite that, I do still think it's quite a good-looking game, but really none of that makes the game stand out. What does make the game stand out, and the core reason for this appeal, and the core reason why this game is being brought to the West after like 5 years in Korea, is because the combat in this game is absolutely phenomenal. It's incredibly deep, it's incredibly dynamic, and it's incredibly challenging and satisfying. Now, the enemies in PvE for leveling are not difficult at all, and you can basically just go around there and use a couple of your abilities that you see listed on the screen and not really get to engage with and experience any of that. But it's when you start to push yourself against more difficult content, and that's pretty much going to be other players, that you can really start to uncover the true depth of the combat in this game. And you can, in some, I hear, PvE instances, experience that as well. I've heard the endgame PvE is quite good. Haven't been able to experience any of that as well. We just had a 3-day tech alpha. Wasn't able to get to endgame and test all of that stuff. But I did get to about mid-level, and you can start PvPing right from level 1. It's not a very good experience if you jump in too early, because the only, apart from not understanding your class or understanding the game very well, you also haven't unlocked many skills by that point. But around level 20 I started to have a really good time with it. I had enough skills to be able to counter things that my opponents threw at me, and even when I came up against characters that were 10 levels higher than me, if I played really well, I was still able to pull out some wins. So that was a pretty good experience. But the PvP in this game is absolutely phenomenal. Again, I say this as someone who doesn't really like PvP in RPGs very much. I especially don't like gear-based PvP. But this is something else. This is incredibly challenging and satisfying. When I go into a game that professes to be highly skill-based, right? When it's like, this is very well-balanced, highly skill-based PvP. What I expect is that in my first 10, 20 matches, I expect to get absolutely crushed. I expect my face to be planted into the ground and ground into the concrete until it's a bloody, mangled mess that is unrecognizable. And I'm very pleased to say in Blade & Soul that's exactly what happened. Whenever I encounter a new class, or whenever I encounter a new playstyle, or whenever I don't fully understand what my opponent's doing or understand my own skills, I get absolutely crushed in this game by anyone who has a bit more experience than me. And I think that is a very good sign. Now, what makes that even better is after I'd played 20, 30 matches, and I started to understand a little bit more some of my skills and started working out some skill combos and some counters and some ways to kind of play mind games with my opponents. I started to get closer and closer to winning. I started working my opponent's HP down. I eventually pulled out a round on an opponent. I had some near wins. I had some near losses, and then eventually I started winning some matches. And those first wins, guys, after all those times of being crushed, but every time I go into a match and get crushed, I felt like I was having some progression, like I was learning something new. Those first couple wins were like some of my best PvP experiences. It reminds me of going back to StarCraft and pulling out some of those epic wins against an evenly matched opponent, because you do get a lot of that in this game, and it is very satisfying. It's even satisfying when you the shoe's on the other foot, and all of a sudden you're facing someone who is new to the game and doesn't have a very good understanding, and you absolutely thump them, and you're like, hey, that used to be me. And even though you're like, that guy's, not as knowledgeable or as skilled as me at this game, but you're like, that's still my progression. That's a way of recognizing my progression. I progressed from that point to this point that I am now, that I'm able to unleash that hurt on someone else. And that is a very, very satisfying experience. So it doesn't look like there's a lot of skills in this game when you look at the screen, right? You'll see just a couple buttons there. And that's because this game doesn't have the typical MMO. You have 20, skill slots where you just drag and drop all your skills in there and you just press them as they come off cooldown and all of that jazz. It's way more combo-based and deep than that. So essentially, what you have is you have a couple of base skills, and you might have a couple of stances to manual class. Every class is wildly different in the way they play. I'm playing the Assassin here, and the Assassin has a decoy stance and a stealth stance. And you can't just click a button and go into stealth, right? Stealth is triggered as an effect of certain different things. Like if you do a particular attack when you're facing the back of your opponent, then you can go into stealth. You can counter with stealth against various things. So a lot of it is contextual. So you need to maneuver yourself and your opponent in a way that can allow you to enter stealth, and then you can do various other skills while in stealth. And then there's a bunch of skills themselves that branch off in different directions. So you might do one ability, and then you'll have an option of two other abilities that you could potentially do, depending on depending on the position of you and your opponent, their status, and things like that. Some abilities only become available when you're stunned, or when your opponent's stunned, or when your opponent's dazed, or when your opponent's on the ground. Something are specific counters to specific things enemies do. Like some opponents might pick you up and grab you to start trying to wail on you, and you might have a skill that you can only do when that happens, and that's a counter to that you have a brief timing window to be able to do. So there's this kind of intricate web of different skills with different contexts that you can use them in, and you kind of have, it's really satisfying and interesting sort of learning all the different ways you can bring these together, and the different ways you can set up a particular skill so that you can use another skill, so that you can use another skill, so that eventually you get things happening where you daze your opponent, or you stun your opponent, and you kick them up in the air and you air juggle them for a bit, maybe you web them in the air there, and then as they drop down, you drop a mine below them, and then you stun them, knocking them down with a mine, and then you do a flip kick to finish them off. You get some epic combos when you start to work all these things out together. So in addition to these kind of dozens of skills that you just unlock through leveling your character, and all these dozens of different contextual skills and all of that, you also are able to modify the way your skills function quite a bit as well. There's a kind of a simpler looking skill tree, but it's rather quite complex when you think about the contextual nature of the skills, right? So you might be able to put 1 or 2 skill points into one of your skills, and that adds a dazing effect to that skill. All of a sudden you didn't have that before, and that change, it sets up a whole new combo. Like for example, when I enter stealth, I have the ability to throw a dagger, and I can then later dash to my opponent and attack them. Now, initially that's just basically a little bit of a damage dealing thing, allows you to reposition, not really too much you can do with that, but I was able to put some points into that and add a dazing effect to that, which then allows me to kick my opponent up, air juggle them, and unleash a much more powerful combo. So that allows me multiple entry points into one of my particular most powerful combos that I've worked out. In addition to that, sometimes you can put points into skills and actually change the way they function entirely. So you can essentially, rather than modifying the way the skill works, you can put points into a kind of a separate tree that will instead change the skill entirely into a new different skill, and that again unlocks a whole heap of different new combos. Now, this is just my experiences when there's like so many options for combos and contextually sensitive skills and various different things that you can work out, and it's very freeform. You get to kind of work out your own combos. You'll find out a few things that you'll use over and over again, and then you might occasionally work out some new combos when you see an opponent do something, or when you think of something, you know, as your opponent does something else, it provokes you into trying something new to counter them, and you learn new things all the time. And my experience has been that, and it's been like incredibly deep and satisfying and challenging. And I'm only halfway through the leveling experience. I have a level 20 character. I think level 45 is the max level at the moment, and there's so many more points I can put into modify skills. I have like 5 points or something to play around with that I can actually spend on modifying skills at this point. There's so much more you can unlock and do and change, and I just imagine that, you know, I still have a dozen skills or more to unlock, and then, you know, hundreds of ways of modifying those skills. And I think, man, how many like different options for combos and setups and things am I going to have in the future? Now, don't just take this footage kind of like for word of the PvP. I would suggest you guys to look up some pro footage from Korea or something like that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of it around on YouTube. Do a bit of a search and watch some of the combat, because it looks very different to what you're seeing here. I think this is pretty fun and even still kind of fast-paced, but when you watch two like highly skilled opponents going at it in this game, it looks a lot like a fighting game, like Tekken or something like that, right? There's just tons of combos and reversals and immunity frames and dodges and counters and air juggling and all of that jazz, and it just looks absolutely insane. So my first impressions of the technical alpha are, again, the PvE is pretty boring in this game as far as leveling is concerned. I've heard the endgame's good, but I can't confirm that personally. The combat kind of is good enough to sort of pull you through the, you know, the not too enjoyable PvE experience, but the PvP in this game is something else. It's some of the best PvP I've ever seen in any RPG or MMO. So my recommendation would be, there's a bunch of betas coming up soon. There is a way to buy in with a supporter pack. I think it's like $25, which will get you into all of those beta weekends and beta periods coming up. And if you'd like to check out the game, then you have the option of doing that. I would suggest that if you think you're into the idea of PvP or action combat MMOs, and you know, you don't mind if the PvE is not that great, and you don't mind slightly dated graphics, then I would suggest keeping a close eye on this MMO, particularly if you have a good ping. I don't know how much more I'm going to play with Blade and Soul because of that ping issue. It really does put a damper on things. Like, there's a lot of stuff I miss because of latency issues. You know, there's a lot of like half-second timing windows to pull off counters and stuff like that, which I just can't do with that sort of a ping, right? By the time I see the button and press it, it's you know, by the time the signal goes through, it's lost. So it certainly puts a damper on my enjoyment. I was able to enjoy it a lot despite that, which is, I think, a testament to the PvP in this game, that it can be enjoyable even with a very laggy connection. But if you guys, you know, are in the US or in EU, then I highly suggest checking this game out once some servers open up near you guys. So, if you guys have played Blade and Soul in other regions, or if you've played some of the alpha and that, or just have any questions about my experience with the game, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Guys, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.